If you believe that this is a passage commanding one man, one woman, then right there with a consistent hermeneutic, you should also see naked and unashamed. And some would see the verses a couple before that as also a command for being horticulturists. So if you guys want to farm and you want a nudist colony, Wilber and McKee might be your point of contact. We got a little echo there. Well, good morning. We have a little bit of a change of location today. We've got a bit of a storm rolling through, but we are going to continue our series here as we take a look at some of the errors and fallacies that are perpetuated by David Wilber and JK McKee in the video, Controversy Corner video that they made about me and trying to address some of the things that they think I stand in error on. So one of the places that they went when they started talking about my views of marriage and what Scripture says about marriage is that they went to what they call the creation ideal. The creation ideal.
Like homosexuality, polygamy is a clear deviation from God's original design for marriage as established in creation. Like homosexuality, polygamy is a clear deviation from God's original design for marriage as established in creation.
This is actually a very common trope within Christendom, to go to this particular spot in Scripture and to try to make a case that they make for monogamy only. And understand that certainly my position and the position of Scripture is that marriage is a good thing. Scripture, I contend, never says monogamy only. It never says monogamy. It never says polygyny. What it says is marriage is a good thing. And we see that actually as it begins in Genesis chapter 2, verses 24 and 25. So Genesis chapter 2, verses 24 and 25, it says, "For this reason a man shall leave his father and his mother, and be joined to his woman, and they shall become one flesh. And the man and his woman were both naked and were not ashamed." Were both naked and not ashamed. Now in Christendom, this is the first place that generally people go to say, see, God created monogamy and that was his ideal from the beginning, and that's what we should be doing. That this is somehow some sort of an ideal. And Wilber and McKee actually went so far as to say any aberration or any alteration or difference from that is sin. Okay? So my questions are several when we take a look at this passage. The first one is this passage prescriptive or is it descriptive? Is this passage telling us what happened, or is it telling us how we're supposed to function in all future and successive generations? Because if this is prescriptive, then that means that we can take any historical piece that, where history is being given to us, and we can somehow extrapolate a command from that. So we'll talk about the command aspect here in just a second. But if we can do that, then it would be interesting to do a study through Scripture, because there's so many problems we could solve. For example, we could take care of an irritating little brother by throwing him in a pit and then selling him to Ishmaelites. That would be a good way to handle little brothers that irritate us, right? That would be using a historical descriptive passage and turning it into a prescription, right? And that's exactly what Christendom has done for a long, long time with this passage. And we're going to talk about the history and where I believe that begins among the church fathers in a few minutes. But Wilber and McKee use this same attitude, and they use this same approach that has been sort of the historical Christian position. So they're not alone in what they say, but I think they're in grave error, as are all others who use this passage in that manner. But there's another question we should ask about this passage. We should ask, what is the penalty? Okay? What is the penalty if you have more than one wife? If you have two, what is the penalty? Where does Scripture give us the penalty? If you have two and there's a penalty associated, what's the penalty for three? If you have three wives, what is the penalty? Where does Scripture spell that out? if there's a penalty for having more than one wife, then clearly it is also a violation of the ideal to have no wife. Was Yeshua in violation of the creation ideal when he did not have a wife? Because he obviously wasn't walking in the ideal. Or maybe another question that we should ask is, was God in violation of the creation ideal when he describes himself at least 3 places in Scripture as having 2 brides? We see that in Jeremiah chapter 3, verses 6 through 12. We see that in Ezekiel 23 with Aholah and Aholibah, 2 daughters of one woman who bore me sons and daughters. We see that in the New Covenant where it says the house of Israel and the house of Judah, not like the covenant I made with them in those days when I was an husband to them. So clearly, at least Yeshua and Yahweh are standing in violation, or describe themselves to be standing in violation of the creation ideal, according to Wilber and McKee and most of Christendom. So those are problematic. There's another problem with using this passage as a prescriptive passage, or as a passage that is a command, and that is an inconsistent hermeneutic. Now, hermeneutics are the rules that are generally used for understanding Scripture or parsing and being able to exegete Scripture properly. And the laws of hermeneutics say that you've got to be consistent through the whole passage. And so this passage says that the 2 shall become one flesh, and the man and his woman were both naked and unashamed. So if the standard is to be monogamous only, is the standard also to be naked and unashamed? And, that's interesting, because if that's the standard, if Wilber and McKee are consistent in their hermeneutic through the whole couple verses here, then we should expect them to begin setting up a nudist colony. That kind of follows. If you believe that this is a passage commanding one man, one woman, then right there with a consistent hermeneutic, you should also see naked and unashamed. And some would see the verses a couple before that as also a command for being horticulturists. So if you guys want a farm and you want a nudist colony, Wilber and McKee might be your point of contact. But where they go looking for a second witness is they go to Yeshua, because Yeshua refers to this passage of Scripture in Matthew chapter 19, as well as a couple of the other Gospels, if I'm not mistaken. But in Matthew chapter 19, we find the verses, let's look at verses 3 through 9. And I want to read the whole context, because always, Christendom, when they trot out this Yeshua is pointing to the creation ideal, they never read the whole passage. They always they lift out of it just the little verse or verse and a half that they want, because the verses around them demonstrate Yeshua is not talking about marriage. He's talking about something else. It says, some Pharisees came to Yeshua testing him and asking, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason at all? So the subject that the Pharisees come and ask about is divorce. Okay? It says, and he answered and said, have you not read what he who created them from the beginning made them male and female? And said, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his woman, and the 2 shall become one flesh. So they are no longer 2, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no man separate. See, he's pointing out the indissolubility of the marriage, okay? When 2 become one flesh, you can't pull them apart. A great illustration is if you take 2 pieces of duct tape and stick them together and then try to pull them apart, it tears stuff up. People are destroyed, and certainly the covenant is broken, and it creates great damage. And Yeshua's point when they ask him about divorce is that man and woman should not be torn apart. Okay, but let's continue the passage. It says, but they said to him, why then did Moses command to give her a certificate of divorce and send her away? He said to them, because of your hardness of heart, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives. But from the beginning, it has not been this way. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except for immorality, and marries another woman, commits adultery, or some translations, causes her to commit adultery. Now, I'd like to make a couple points about this passage because few people take the time to study this deeply. And this is actually a passage of Scripture that is very important in understanding marriage and how marriage works and what God's plan is for marriage. First off, one of the points that we need to understand is that Yeshua is talking about this during a time frame when in Greco-Roman law, the common law of the region around him, and the law that had to a degree been absorbed by some of the Pharisees, which we know Hellenism had been in Israel for at least 150 years, okay, because the Maccabees and all that time before that, and then from that time on, there was a great deal of Hellenistic influence. It was very common in Hellenism to have one woman and then to send her away and have another woman and then to send her away and, trade her up for a newer model or something of this sort. And what Yeshua, to start with this passage where it says divorce, the text actually says send her away. So the Pharisees were asking him, is it okay for a man to send away his wife without giving her a certificate of divorce that allows her to remarry, and instead putting her in a very difficult position? Because the man could just go remarry, it's not a problem. The woman, though, is still under contract to him, but now in a culture that wherein she needs a covering. She has to find a man, and in doing so, she marries and commits adultery, or he is then responsible for the adultery that she commits because she's still under covenant with the man that sent her away. And in this passage, 4 times the use send away is actually what's there. It doesn't say divorce. So there's not the Pharisees who are asking this question are asking it. They're not even issuing a get or a certificate of divorce. Instead, they're basically mistreating and throwing away a woman. Now, Wilber and McKee both talk about valuing women, and yet they don't understand what this passage is really about. And Yeshua is really addressing is valuing women. He's not talking at all about polygyny, because we're going to talk about in just a second what was going on at that time as well. What he's saying is that the marriage of a man and a woman, the union, the one flesh union, just as we see in Genesis chapter 2, is indissoluble. It cannot be torn apart. Man has a covenantal responsibility to fulfill when he takes a woman. And so that is the purpose of what Yeshua is talking about in this passage. Now, we know this because Yeshua is echoing the words of God through Malachi the prophet. Malachi the prophet writes in chapter 2, verse 16, he writes, "For I hate divorce." And technically, again, the passage says sending away, okay? "For I hate divorce, says Yahweh the Elohim of Israel. And him who covers his garment with wrong, says Yahweh Tsevaot. So take heed to your spirit that you do not deal treacherously." And he's addressing particularly the priests at that time, but addressing others who were simply sending women away so that they could not have the responsibility of taking care of her, and instead could trade to a different model. And God is very specific on this. So what we need to stop and we need to understand is that Yeshua was not addressing monogamy only. In fact, he's addressing the indissolubility of marriage, period. Scripture never talks about monogamy or polygyny. It just talks about marriage. What we know from historians, and again, this is where Wilber and McKee have not done their homework. And I've said this multiple times, and there are multiple places where we can demonstrate they have not done their homework. If they simply go read Josephus in his Antiquities of the Jews, it acknowledges in roughly nearly a dozen places, that it was common for Jews to have more than one woman at the time of Yeshua. I will put a link down below for an article that is online by Ariel Schremer. He wrote an article for the American Academy of Jewish Research that is titled "How Much Jewish Polygyny in Roman Palestine?" And in that article, he demonstrates as well that polygyny was not an uncommon thing at the time of Yeshua. It was commonly practiced among the Jews. In fact, the church fathers agree with this because Justin Martyr, in his dialogue with Typho, written roughly 150 years after Yeshua, he says in that dialogue, he actually accuses the Jews of having 4 or 5 wives and laws by their blind and stupid teachers that allow them to marry as many as they wish. So he admits that even 150 years after Yeshua, polygyny was very common among the Jews. It was not an uncommon thing. So Yeshua, again, if he was going to speak against a man having more than one wife, he should have been a whole lot more intentional about it than addressing it tangentially through something that actually deals with the indissolubility of marriage. And Paul uses the passage exactly the same way. He's talking about the fact that you don't want to become one flesh with someone that is wrong. I think he does it in the context of sexual immorality because it's an indissoluble union. And so that's the point that is being made. It's not that you can't have more than one. It's the fact that when you do, you better be good for it. Okay? So where do we get this idea for a creation ideal? Because it doesn't show up in the Tanakh. It doesn't show up with David's writings, and obviously not with what he did, because he had at least 8 wives and 10 concubines that we know of. We have multiple other godly men throughout Scripture where it lists specifically what they had with regards to marriage. In many cases, more than one wife. The men of Issachar, we're told, were wise and discerning. And it also said that they had many wives. That's, I think, in 1 Chronicles chapter 4, maybe something like that. So where do we get this creation ideal argument? It can largely be traced to Tertullian around 200 CE. And Tertullian wrote De Monogamia, or On Monogamy, among other writings, wherein he uses parts of Scripture, often out of context. He also uses Greco-Roman law, natural law, and pagan influences to make his case for what he believes is a higher ideal, and that is monogamy, or monogamy-only, I should say. What's interesting to note is that Tertullian actually came to a place in his belief system where he preferred a, quote, sexless marriage and valued virginity, chastity, and asceticism as higher ideals even than having a sexless marriage. So that will tell you a little bit about where Tertullian's trajectory of thought led him, and it was straight into Roman asceticism. And even in De Monogamia, he specifically says that that he holds in high regard the Vestal virgins who were virgins for life in pagan temples. And he says, if they can do it, then maybe we can do it. And they hold a higher standard. So go look it up. That's in his argument for monogamy. Okay? Here's what Witt has to say about Tertullian. And you'll recall from our resources video that Witt agrees with monogamy. Witt makes an argument for monogamy, but he's smart enough from all of his research to say it can't be made from Scripture, that Scripture doesn't teach monogamy only, that it actually comes from Greco-Roman law and from a quintessentially Greek tradition, as Walter Scheidel says, a Stanford professor. But he says, perhaps it was these anomalies that persuaded Tertullian in later life to call for the prohibition of second marriages altogether for anyone, clerical or lay, man or woman, divorced or widowed. This was part and product of his increasingly negative attitude towards sex, marriage, and family life altogether, which was a feature of the Montanist sect that he joined in his later years. Tertullian had never been robust in his embrace of sex and marriage. Indeed, he wrote to his wife that he wanted to have a sexless spiritual marriage as much as possible, but in his last years as a Montanist and as a widower, he moved to a rigid sexual asceticism that discouraged first marriages and prohibited all second marriages. Instead, he extolled virginity, chastity, and celibacy as the higher spiritual good for Christians who were called to emulate the purity of Jesus and the virginity of Mary, his mother. Okay? So we recognize that one of the great church fathers, one of the founders of monogamy only as the church, the Christian standard, Tertullian, he's one of your church fathers, and he's one of the ones that Wilber and McKee hold in high regard, whether they know it or not, because that's the foundation. And if you go read De Monogamia, it'll take you maybe 30 or 40 minutes. It's a fairly short piece. You can find it online. You'll see that there are lots of holes you can punch in that argument, and that he bases much of it in Greco-Roman law and paganism, believing that to be a higher ideal. But he wasn't the only one. Clement of Alexandria based his arguments for monogamy only on natural law. In his writing Stromata, 347, Clement claims that God allowed polygamy in the Old Testament, but he no longer approves of polygamy. So see, these guys also, they acknowledge that it's allowed in Scripture, but ultimately what they have is they have a God who changes, not unlike McKee, who makes the statement that everything changed with Yeshua, and all that stuff that happened in the Old Testament no longer applies because we're going back to a standard from the creation ideal, which we can demonstrate is not a commandment. It just is not a commandment. Okay, is it prescriptive, or is it descriptive? It describes what happened. It doesn't tell us how we're to function in the future. But others from that time frame, Chrysostom wrote some vile things about marriage and about the Jews and about Jacob, and he admits that the practice of polygyny among Christians and Jews was still contemporary to him in the 300s. Ultimately, it was at the tip of the sword of the Roman Empire that Christendom was forced away from even practicing polygyny, as much as these guys were preaching against it. St. Augustine, Jerome, Lactantius, etc., all preached on monogamy and all rooted at least part of their argument in Roman law and the higher ideal of natural law in Roman paganism. All you have to do is witness Tertullian's appeal to the Vestal Virgins in De Monogamia. So, who do we believe? Do we listen to the church fathers? Do we listen to the men who today echo the church fathers? They place their trust and they build their belief system for marriage out of what the fathers of Christendom wrote in the 200s, 300s, 400s, even though we can verify from documents at that time that polygyny was common among the Jews? Or do we believe the word of our Father that right here specifically tells us? He lays it out for us. And over we see that there's no command against a man having more than one wife. There are multiple commands on how he's to do that if he does it in order to do so righteously. And we find that there are places that there are commands that if you don't do it, even though married, that you're committing sin. It's actually sin not to in some cases of levirate marriage and others. So it can't be a sin in one case and not a sin in other cases. It's a sin not to in certain cases. It's something we'll address a little bit farther down the road as we continue this. But what I'd like to do is I'd like to close with a couple pieces of scripture right quick. In Jeremiah chapter 16, verses 19 and following, we read, O Lord, my strength and my stronghold and my refuge in the day of distress. To you the nations will come from the ends of the earth and say, Our fathers have inherited nothing but falsehood, futility, and things of no profit. Can man make for himself gods? Yet they are not gods. Therefore, behold, I am going to make them know. This time I will make them know my power and my might, and they shall know that my name is Yahweh. A final verse that I'd like to, from Jeremiah chapter 6. In Jeremiah chapter 6, we're commanded to stand by the ways. This is Jeremiah 6:16. Thus says Yahweh, stand by the ways and see and ask for the ancient paths, where the good way is, and walk in it, and you will find rest for your souls. But they said, we will not walk in it. And I set watchmen over you, saying, listen to the sound of the trumpet. But they said, we will not listen. Therefore hear, O nations, and know, O congregation, what is among them. Hear, O earth, behold, I am bringing disaster on this people, the fruit of their plans, because they have not listened to my words, and as for my Torah, they have rejected it also. When we reject the option of a man to have more than one wife, we reject the fathers, and we reject provision that the Torah has for taking care of widows and orphans, and we reject the truth of Scripture, and we reject Jacob, our father, who had 4 wives. Do we trust what the Torah says, or do we trust what man says? Do we trust what the church fathers say, or do we trust what our Father says? Think about it. The next place that we're going to go as we wrap up some of the things that we're addressing directly with Wilber, the subject matter will continue. No question, there's a lot more that needs to be covered here because Christendom has really got this messed up, and the Hebrew roots community as well has got this messed up. But the next video that we're going to go to is we're going to go to Leviticus 18:18 and demonstrate unequivocally that Wilber and McKee's interpretation of Leviticus 18:18 is absolutely stone cold wrong. It is stone cold wrong. And we will demonstrate this in our next video. Shalom. Man has a responsibility. Figured that would come up.